You're lying in your comfortable cabin bed, gently rocking with the ocean waves, when suddenly you hear footsteps in the corridor outside. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. But here's the thing that makes your blood run cold. You're on deck 12. The crew quarters are 5 floors below. And according to the ship's manifest, this entire section was supposed to be empty tonight. What you're about to hear are 10 true stories from the darkest corners of the cruise ship industry. Stories that cruise lines desperately don't want you to know. Stories of passengers who checked in but never checked out, of crew members who still patrol the decks decades after their deaths, and of ships that have become floating prisons for the restless dead. I'm going to take you on a journey through the most haunted vessels ever to sail the 7 seas. Each story more terrifying than the last. Each one verified by multiple witnesses, documented by paranormal investigators, and covered up by an industry that values profits over the truth. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a voyage into the supernatural. Because once you hear these stories, you'll never look at a cruise ship the same way again. Before we start, give me a little favor. Only 1% of you actually hit the like button. Even though you love these horror stories, 1 second to smash that like helps me grow so much and keeps these daily nightmares coming. Let's dive into the story. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how most cruise ships don't have a cabin 1313? Well, there's a reason for that. And it all started with 1 ship, 1 cabin, and 1 passenger who refused to leave. The year was 1995, and the Crown Princess had just completed its maiden voyage. Everything seemed perfect until they started getting complaints about cabin 1313. Passengers reported hearing sobbing through the walls, finding their belongings mysteriously rearranged, and waking up to the sensation of someone sitting on the edge of their bed. But the real terror began when the Hendersons checked into that cabin during a 7-day Caribbean cruise. Margaret Henderson was celebrating her 50th wedding anniversary with her husband Robert. They were thrilled to finally take the cruise they had dreamed about their entire marriage. On the second night, Margaret woke up around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom. As she walked across the cabin, she noticed a woman sitting in the chair by the window. At first, she thought it was her reflection in the glass. But then the woman turned around. Margaret later described the face as pale as moonlight, with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through her. The woman was wearing a 1940s style dress, completely out of place on a modern cruise ship. When Margaret blinked, the woman vanished. Robert didn't believe her at first. You know how it is when you're groggy and disoriented in an unfamiliar place. Your mind can play tricks on you. But that changed on night 3 when he saw her too. The woman was standing at the foot of their bed, staring down at them with those same hollow eyes. This time she spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, but the words chilled them to their bones. "He threw me overboard," she said. "I'm still waiting for him to come back." The Hendersons demanded to be moved to another cabin immediately. The cruise staff, clearly uncomfortable with the request, quietly relocated them without asking questions. But that wasn't the end of their nightmare. 3 cabins down the hall, they could still hear her crying every night. Soft, mournful sobs that seemed to echo through the ship's ventilation system. Other passengers began complaining too. Children reported seeing a sad lady in their rooms. Adults felt cold spots and unexplained drafts. Here's where the story gets really disturbing. The cruise line started an internal investigation, and what they discovered changed everything. In 1947, a passenger named Eleanor Whitman had indeed been thrown overboard from that exact cabin location. Her husband claimed she had committed suicide, but witnesses later came forward saying they had heard arguing and screaming from their room the night she disappeared. Eleanor's body was never recovered. Her husband returned home and collected her life insurance, living comfortably for the rest of his days. Justice was never served. Eleanor was never put to rest. But Eleanor wasn't done seeking justice. The manifestations grew stronger over the years. Passengers reported finding wet footprints leading from the cabin to the ship's railing. Security cameras captured unexplained figures walking the decks at night. Most terrifying of all, several passengers reported being pushed or grabbed by invisible hands when they got too close to the railings. The cruise line tried everything. They brought in priests to perform blessings. They had psychics attempt to communicate with Eleanor's spirit. They even tried renumbering the cabin. Nothing worked. Finally, in 2003, they made the decision that most cruise lines make when faced with persistent hauntings. They sealed off cabin 1313 permanently. If you look at the deck plans of most Royal Caribbean ships today, you'll notice the numbers jump from 1312 to 1314. They'll tell you it's because of superstition about the number 13. But now you know the truth. Yet even with the cabin sealed, Eleanor's presence remains. Passengers still report seeing a woman in 1940s clothing wandering the corridors at night. She's looking for her husband, they say, still waiting for him to come back and face what he did. And here's the part that will make you think twice before booking that next cruise. The ship's records show that 3 passengers have gone overboard from that deck since Eleanor's cabin was sealed. 3 different incidents, all ruled as accidents or suicides. But the crew whispers a different story. They say Eleanor is still seeking justice, one passenger at a time. The cruise industry has tried to bury this story, but Eleanor's legend has spread throughout the fleet. Crew members refuse to work alone on Deck 12. Passengers who know the story request rooms as far away as possible. Because everyone who sails these waters knows one thing for certain. Eleanor Whitman is still aboard, and she's not sailing alone. Wait until you hear what happened on the Queen Mary. If you thought Eleanor's story was disturbing, the next tale will make your skin crawl. Because some ships don't just carry the dead, they're built on their graves. The Queen Mary isn't just haunted. It's a floating catalog of human suffering. This massive ship, now permanently docked in Long Beach, California, served as both a luxury liner and a troop transport during World War II. Over its decades of service, it became home to more documented paranormal activity than any other vessel in maritime history. But of all the spirits that roam the Queen Mary's corridors, none is more terrifying than the entity that resides in room B340. And trust me, after you hear this story, you'll understand why the room has been sealed off from guests for over 30 years. The trouble with B340 began in the 1960s, shortly after the Queen Mary completed its transformation from military vessel back to passenger ship. Guests staying in the room reported the same phenomena night after night. Around 2:30 a.m., they would be awakened by the sound of a woman screaming in absolute terror. The screams weren't coming from the corridor or adjacent rooms. They were coming from inside B340 itself. Guests would sit up in bed, hearts racing, trying to locate the source of the horrific sounds. But the room would be empty except for them. The screaming would last exactly 3 minutes and 17 seconds, every single time. Then silence. Dead silence that was somehow more unsettling than the screams themselves. Now, you might think sleep-deprived passengers were just having nightmares. That's what the Queen Mary's management thought too, until they started getting complaints every single night. Different guests, same experience. Same time, same duration. Security guards were stationed outside B340 to investigate. Night after night, they would hear the screaming from the hallway. When they rushed into the room, they would find terrified guests huddled in their beds, insisting the sounds came from inside the cabin. But security never heard anything from within the room when they entered. The situation escalated dramatically in 1975 when a guest named Thomas Mitchell was staying in B340 with his wife Sarah. Thomas was a skeptical man. a retired engineer who didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural nonsense. When the screaming started at 2:30 a.m., he was determined to find a logical explanation. As the terrifying sounds filled their cabin, Thomas got out of bed and began searching every inch of the room. He checked the ventilation system, looked for hidden speakers, examined the walls for acoustic anomalies. His wife begged him to stop, to just wait for it to end like it always did. But Thomas was stubborn. As the screaming reached its crescendo, he pressed his ear against the bathroom door, trying to pinpoint the source. That's when he felt it. A hand, ice cold and impossibly strong, grabbed him by the shoulder and yanked him backward with tremendous force. Sarah watched in horror as her husband was lifted off his feet and thrown across the room. He crashed into the opposite wall and crumpled to the floor, unconscious. When security arrived, they found Thomas with 3 cracked ribs and bruising on his shoulder that matched the pattern of human fingertips. But here's the detail that still gives investigators chills. The fingerprint pattern in the bruising didn't match any living person. Forensic experts who examined the photographs said the prints belonged to someone with unusually long, thin fingers, almost skeletal in appearance. The Queen Mary's management tried to explain away the incident. Thomas had a medical episode, they claimed. He fell and injured himself during a seizure or dizzy spell. But Thomas knew what he had experienced. More importantly, he knew what he had seen in the split second before he was thrown. Standing behind him in the bathroom mirror was a woman with sunken cheeks and wild, desperate eyes. Her mouth was open in a scream, but no sound was coming out. It was as if she was the one screaming, but the sound was somehow displaced, echoing through the room instead of coming from her throat. After the incident with Thomas Mitchell, the Queen Mary quietly removed B340 from their booking system. Officially, the room needed renovation. Unofficially, they couldn't risk another guest being physically attacked by whatever resided there. But removing the room from guest use didn't end the phenomena. Crew members working in adjacent areas continued to hear the screaming. Maintenance workers refused to enter B340 alone. Several employees reported seeing a woman in a 1940s dress wandering the B-deck corridors at night, always heading toward room 340. The breakthrough in understanding came from Eleanor Murphy, a paranormal investigator who gained access to the ship's wartime records in 1987. What she discovered explained everything, and it was more horrific than anyone had imagined. During the Queen Mary's service as a troop transport, Room B340 had been used as a makeshift surgery for the most severe cases. Wounded soldiers who were unlikely to survive were brought there for last-ditch medical procedures. The room had no proper surgical equipment, no adequate anesthesia. According to the medical logs, dozens of soldiers died in that room, many of them screaming in agony as doctors performed desperate operations without proper pain relief. But that wasn't the worst part. Eleanor's research revealed that the room had also been used for another, more sinister purpose. Female passengers who died during the voyage were temporarily stored in B340 before burial at sea. One particular entry caught her attention. An unnamed woman who had apparently died by suicide in 1943, found in her cabin with her throat cut. But here's what the records didn't say, and what Eleanor pieced together from crew interviews decades later. The woman hadn't committed suicide. She had been murdered by a fellow passenger who claimed she was a German spy. Her body was discovered in B340, where it had been hidden for 3 days while her killer spread rumors about her being a traitor. The woman had died screaming, trying to prove her innocence. She had been an American citizen, traveling to visit family in England. The man who killed her was later revealed to be suffering from severe psychological trauma from combat. He was quietly discharged, and the incident was covered up to maintain morale. So the screaming that guests hear in B340 isn't random paranormal activity. It's the echo of genuine terror, the dying cries of an innocent woman whose murder was covered up by military bureaucracy. She screams for exactly 3 minutes and 17 seconds because that's how long it took her to die. The Queen Mary has never officially acknowledged the true history of room B340. The room remains sealed, accessible only to researchers and paranormal investigators with special permission. But her screams continue to echo through the ship's corridors, a reminder that some injustices transcend death. And if you think that's the most terrifying story from the Queen Mary, wait until you hear about what lurks in the engine room. Because while the woman in B340 screams for justice, the entity below decks hunts for revenge. The SS United States was once the pride of American maritime engineering. The fastest passenger ship ever built, she set speed records that stand to this day. But speed couldn't outrun the darkness that settled into her engine room and the malevolent presence that still lurks in the depths of this now abandoned vessel. Unlike the sorrowful spirits of other haunted ships, the entity in the United States engine room is different. It's angry, it's violent, and according to every crew member who ever worked those lower decks, it's hunting. The first recorded incident happened in 1954, just 2 years after the ship entered service. Chief Engineer Robert Castellano was conducting a routine midnight inspection when he heard footsteps behind him in the engine room. Heavy work boots on metal grating, a sound he knew well from his 30 years at sea. When Castellano turned around, the footsteps stopped. The engine room was empty except for him. He called out, thinking maybe a crew member was pulling a prank. Silence. Nothing but the rhythmic pounding of the massive engines. But as Castellano continued his inspection, the footsteps resumed. Always behind him, always matching his pace. When he stopped, they stopped. When he walked faster, they kept up. This continued for 20 minutes until he finally climbed back to the upper decks, his nerves completely shot. Castellano reported the incident to the captain, who dismissed it as the normal sounds of a working ship. Metal expands and contracts, machinery settles, pipes adjust. Every sailor knows that ships make strange noises, but Castellano knew the difference between mechanical sounds and human footsteps. The problem was, Castellano wasn't the only one experiencing these encounters. Over the next 6 months, every engineer who worked the night shift reported the same phenomenon. Footsteps in the engine room, always following, never revealing their source. The crew started referring to their invisible companion as the Walker. At first, it was almost a joke, a weird quirk of the ship that they would laugh about over coffee. But the Walker wasn't content to simply pace the engine room. Engineering mate Danny Kowalski was the first to experience the Walker's more aggressive behavior. Danny was working alone in the engine room around 11 p.m., performing routine maintenance on one of the secondary pumps. The footsteps started as usual, following him as he moved between the machinery. But this time, when Danny stopped walking, the footsteps didn't stop. They kept coming, getting closer. Danny grabbed his flashlight and swept it around the engine room, his heart pounding. Nothing, just shadows and machinery. Then he felt a hand grip his shoulder with crushing force. Danny spun around, but no one was there. The hand squeezed tighter, fingernails digging through his work shirt and into his skin. Danny struggled to break free, but the grip was impossibly strong. For 30 seconds, Danny was held in place by invisible hands while those phantom footsteps circled around him. He could hear breathing, heavy and labored, right next to his ear. Then suddenly he was released. Danny stumbled forward and ran for the ladder, not stopping until he reached the main deck. When Danny reported the incident, the ship's doctor found fingernail marks on his shoulder, deep gouges that had drawn blood, arranged in a pattern that suggested unusually large hands with long, sharp nails. Danny was treated for shock and given the rest of the week off. But the attacks escalated. 2 weeks later, engineering assistant Mike Torres was knocked unconscious in the engine room. He was found at the bottom of a maintenance ladder with a severe concussion and multiple bruises. Mike claimed he had been pushed, but there was no one else in the engine room at the time. The ship's management was facing a serious problem. The engine room crew was refusing to work alone. Productivity was suffering, and rumors were spreading throughout the ship about a dangerous presence below decks. They needed answers. Captain Harold Manning decided to conduct his own investigation. Manning was a no-nonsense career naval officer who didn't believe in ghost stories. He spent 3 nights in the engine room, armed with cameras and recording equipment, determined to debunk the crew's claims. On the 3rd night, Manning got more than he bargained for. Around midnight, his equipment detected significant temperature drops throughout the engine room. The recordings captured the sound of footsteps and what appeared to be heavy breathing. Most disturbing of all, the cameras showed shadows moving independently of any light source. But it was what Manning experienced personally that changed everything. As he was reviewing his equipment, he felt someone watching him. The sensation was overwhelming, like being stared at by a predator. When he turned around, he saw a figure standing between 2 massive engines. The figure was tall and gaunt, wearing what appeared to be engine room coveralls from an earlier era. But it was the face that made Manning's blood run cold. Hollow eye sockets, sunken cheeks, and a mouth twisted in permanent rage. The figure raised one skeletal hand and pointed directly at Manning. Manning blinked, and the figure was gone. But the message was clear. This entity didn't want to be investigated. It wanted to be left alone to continue its dark work in the depths of the ship. Research into the ship's construction records revealed the truth behind the walker. During the building of the SS United States, a worker named Vincent Torino had died in an accident in what would become the engine room. Vincent had fallen from a scaffolding and was crushed by a piece of heavy machinery. But there was more to Vincent's story. According to his co-workers, Vincent had discovered that safety protocols were being ignored to meet construction deadlines. He had threatened to report the violations to federal inspectors. 2 days before his scheduled meeting with investigators, Vincent had his fatal accident. The circumstances of Vincent's death were suspicious, but the investigation was quickly closed. The shipyard was under enormous pressure to complete the United States on schedule, and any delays would have cost millions of dollars. Vincent's death was ruled accidental, and construction continued. Vincent Torino's body was buried in a small cemetery in Newport News, Virginia. But his spirit never left the engine room where he died. The walker wasn't just a random haunting. It was Vincent still trying to expose the safety violations that led to his death. Here's the truly disturbing part. Every crew member who experienced attacks from the walker had one thing in common. They had all discovered or reported safety violations in the engine room. Faulty equipment, inadequate maintenance, dangerous shortcuts. Vincent's spirit was targeting anyone who might expose the same kind of negligence that had killed him. The SS United States was retired from passenger service in 1969, but Vincent remains. The ship now sits abandoned at a pier in Philadelphia, slowly deteriorating while developers argue over her future. Urban explorers and maritime enthusiasts who have gained access to the engine room report that the walker is still there, still patrolling, still hunting. Security guards hired to watch the ship refuse to venture below the main deck after dark. They've heard the footsteps, seen the shadows, felt the overwhelming presence of something that doesn't want them there. Vincent Torino died protecting the safety of others, and even death hasn't ended his vigil. The walker represents something different from the other spirits we've discussed. Eleanor in cabin 1313 seeks justice. The woman in B340 screams for recognition. But Vincent in the engine room represents pure rage. The fury of a man who was murdered for trying to do the right thing, condemned to haunt the place where corruption and greed cost him his life. But wait until you hear about the dancing lady of the Carnival triumph. Because some spirits don't just haunt ships, they follow them wherever they go, spreading their curse across entire fleets. The Carnival triumph should have been a celebration of modern cruise technology. When she launched in 1999, she was one of the largest and most advanced ships in the Carnival fleet. But from her very first voyage, passengers and crew reported encounters with an entity so persistent and so disturbing that she became known throughout the industry as the most haunted ship still in active service. The spirit that haunts the Triumph is known as the Dancing Lady, and her presence has been documented on over 1,000 separate occasions. Unlike other ship hauntings that remain confined to specific areas, the Dancing Lady roams throughout the entire vessel, appearing in corridors, theaters, dining rooms, and even passenger cabins. But here's what makes the Dancing Lady different from other maritime spirits. She doesn't seem to know she's dead. Night after night, she continues the same routine she followed in life, as if she's still a passenger on an endless cruise that never reaches port. The first sighting occurred during the Triumph's maiden voyage. Passenger Linda Rodriguez was returning to her cabin around 11 p.m. when she noticed a woman in an elegant evening gown walking ahead of her in the corridor. What caught Linda's attention was the woman's old-fashioned clothing and the way she seemed to glide rather than walk. Linda tried to catch up to compliment the woman on her beautiful dress, but every time she got close, the woman would turn a corner or disappear around a bend. This continued for several minutes until Linda found herself completely lost in a section of the ship she didn't recognize. When Linda finally found her way back to her cabin, she mentioned the encounter to her cabin steward. The steward's reaction was immediate and alarming. His face went pale, and he quickly made an excuse to leave. Later, Linda learned that the steward had quit his job the next day, citing personal reasons. Over the next several voyages, sightings of the Dancing Lady became increasingly common. Passengers reported seeing her in the ship's main ballroom, dancing alone to music that no one else could hear. Security cameras captured footage of a figure in flowing fabric moving through empty corridors at night. Most disturbing of all, several guests reported that the Dancing Lady had appeared in their cabins, standing at the foot of their beds and swaying gently as if hearing a distant waltz. The breakthrough in understanding came from Margaret Chen, a former Carnival employee who had access to the ship's construction records. What Margaret discovered explained the Dancing Lady's presence, and it was more tragic than anyone had imagined. The Triumph had been built in the same Italian shipyard where another Carnival vessel, the Festival, had undergone major renovations in 1998. During those renovations, a female passenger named Isabella Rossetti had died in a tragic accident. Isabella was a wealthy widow from Milan who had been taking regular cruises since her husband's death 5 years earlier. She loved to dance and was known throughout the Carnival fleet for her elegant evening gowns and graceful movements on the dance floor. Isabella had been staying on the Festival during the renovation period, having paid extra to remain aboard while the ship was in dry dock. On the night of her death, Isabella had been found at the bottom of a staircase near the main ballroom, her neck broken from the fall. She was wearing her favorite evening gown, a blue silk creation that she had planned to wear to that evening's captain's dinner. The accident was ruled as a simple fall, the result of poor lighting during the construction period. But here's where Margaret's investigation revealed disturbing details. Isabella's body showed signs of a struggle. Her evening gown was torn, her jewelry was missing, and she had defensive wounds on her hands. The ship's doctor who examined Isabella noted these inconsistencies in his report but was overruled by investigators who wanted to close the case quickly. More troubling still, 3 crew members who had been working near the ballroom that night were never interviewed. These men had left the ship immediately after Isabella's death, claiming they had found other employment. Attempts to locate them for questioning were unsuccessful. The evidence suggests that Isabella Rossetti was murdered, possibly during a robbery attempt. She had been known to carry expensive jewelry and large amounts of cash, making her a target for crew members who knew her habits. Her death was covered up to avoid negative publicity during the renovation period. But Isabella's spirit didn't rest with her body. When materials from the festival were transferred to the newly constructed Triumph, Isabella's presence came with them. Specifically, the main ballroom's dance floor had been salvaged from the festival and installed in the Triumph. Isabella's spirit was bound to the place where she had spent her happiest moments, and now she was trapped aboard a ship she had never sailed in life. The dancing lady's appearances follow a predictable pattern. She manifests most strongly during formal dinner nights, when passengers dress in evening wear reminiscent of her own era. Witnesses describe her as a woman in her 60s with silver hair elegantly styled, wearing a blue silk evening gown that seems to shimmer and flow as she moves. Isabella appears to be reliving the same evening over and over. She walks from her cabin to the dining room, then to the ballroom for dancing, and finally returns to her room. But because she's trapped in the memories of her final night, the routine never varies. She's caught in an endless loop, unaware that decades have passed. The most heartbreaking encounters occur when passengers try to interact with Isabella. She seems to see them and will sometimes nod or smile, but she can't hear them speak. Several guests have reported trying to warn her about the danger she's walking into, but Isabella continues her routine regardless, heading inevitably toward her tragic end. Here's what makes Isabella's haunting particularly disturbing. Unlike other ship spirits who eventually find peace, Isabella's presence has grown stronger over time. The curse has spread beyond the Triumph to other ships in the Carnival fleet, particularly those that have received transferred materials during renovations. Crew members throughout the Carnival fleet now report sightings of the dancing lady. She appears on ships she never sailed, in ballrooms she never visited, following the same tragic routine night after night. Her presence has become so common that new crew members are informally briefed about Isabella during their orientation. But the dancing lady's curse goes deeper than simple hauntings. Ships where Isabella has been sighted experience significantly higher rates of accidents and medical emergencies during formal dinner nights. Passengers fall down staircases, elderly guests suffer heart attacks on the dance floor, and jewelry thefts spike dramatically. It's as if Isabella's violent death has created a vortex of negative energy that follows her spirit throughout the fleet. She's not malicious, but her presence brings with it the echo of the violence that ended her life. The most recent encounter with Isabella occurred just last month aboard the Carnival Valor. Passenger Rebecca Martinez was photographing the formal dinner when she noticed an elegantly dressed woman in the background of her pictures. The woman wasn't visible to the naked eye, but the camera captured her image clearly. In the photograph, Isabella appears to be reaching out toward the camera with a desperate expression, as if she's trying to communicate something important. Enhancement of the image revealed that Isabella appears to be mouthing the same word repeatedly. Help! 60 years after her death, Isabella Rossetti is still trying to tell someone what really happened to her that night. She's still looking for justice, still seeking someone who will listen to her story and expose the truth about her murder. The dancing lady represents one of the most persistent and widespread hauntings in maritime history. Her presence spans multiple ships and decades, touching the lives of thousands of passengers and crew members. She's a reminder that some spirits refuse to rest until their stories are told and their killers are exposed. But Isabella's story is just the beginning. Wait until you hear about the phantom children of the Disney magic, because some hauntings are so disturbing that they challenge everything we think we know about life, death, and the innocence of childhood. Disney cruise ships are supposed to be the epitome of family entertainment, places where childhood dreams come alive and magical memories are made. But the Disney magic harbors a dark secret that the company has desperately tried to hide for over 2 decades. On Deck 9, in the areas designated for children's activities, ghostly children continue to play long after the sun goes down. The first reports came from crew members working the night shift in the kids' clubs. Custodial staff cleaning the play areas after hours reported hearing children's laughter echoing through empty rooms. At first, management dismissed these reports as the normal sounds of a ship at sea, or perhaps audio bleeding through from entertainment systems. But the reports became impossible to ignore when security cameras began capturing evidence. Night after night, the footage showed the same phenomena. Toys moving on their own, balls rolling across empty playrooms, and shadowy figures that appeared to be children running through the corridors. The breakthrough came from Maria Gonzalez, a veteran Disney cruise employee who had worked children's programming for 15 years. Maria was working late one evening in the Oceaner Club, Disney's main children's area, when she heard something that made her blood run cold. A child was crying somewhere in the darkened play area. Soft, muffled sobs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Maria grabbed her flashlight and began searching, thinking perhaps a child had hidden during the evening's activities and been accidentally locked in. But as Maria searched, she began to hear voices. Multiple children, whispering and giggling in the darkness. She called out, identifying herself as a crew member, but the whispers only grew louder. Then she saw them. 3 children, translucent and glowing with a faint blue light, were playing in the corner of the room. They appeared to be around 8 or 9 years old, wearing clothing that seemed decades out of date. As Maria watched in stunned silence, the children looked up at her and smiled. One of them, a little girl with pigtails, spoke in a voice that seemed to echo from a great distance. "Will you play with us? We've been waiting so long for someone to play with us." Maria backed toward the door, her heart pounding. But the children followed, their feet not quite touching the ground as they glided across the floor. "Please don't leave," the little girl continued. "Everyone always leaves. We just want to play." Maria stumbled out of the room and locked the door behind her, but she could still hear the children inside, crying and begging her to come back. She reported the incident to her supervisor immediately, but her report was buried in corporate paperwork and she was quietly transferred to another ship. But Maria's encounter was just the beginning. Over the next several months, dozens of crew members reported similar experiences. Children's voices in empty play areas, ghostly figures in the ship's corridors, and most disturbing of all, physical interactions with entities that seemed to be genuinely confused about their situation. The pattern that emerged was heartbreaking. These weren't malevolent spirits trying to frighten people. They were the ghosts of children who seemed to think they were still on vacation, still playing, still waiting for their parents to come find them. The investigation into the phantom children's identities revealed a tragic connection to Disney's maritime history. The Disney Magic had been built using materials and components from several decommissioned cruise ships, including some that had experienced tragic accidents involving children. Most significantly, the ship's main children's play area had been constructed using deck plating from the SS Normandy, which had been destroyed in a fire during its conversion to a troop transport in 1942. During that fire, several children who had been touring the ship with their families had become trapped in what would later become the location of Disney's Kids Club. 3 children had died in that fire. Sarah Mitchell, age 8, Tommy Chen, age 9, and Maria Santos, age 7. Their bodies were recovered from the area that would later become Deck 9 of the Disney Magic. The children had become separated from their parents during the evacuation and had hidden in what they thought was a safe room. only to be overcome by smoke. But the connection went deeper than just recycled materials. Research revealed that the Disney Magic's children's programming had been designed using plans from pre-war cruise ships, including some layouts that directly mirrored the areas where the three children had died. It was as if the Disney Magic had been unknowingly constructed as a perfect replica of the environment where Sarah, Tommy, and Maria had spent their final moments. The phantom children weren't haunting the ship randomly. They were continuing to play in the same spaces where they had played in life. The encounters with the phantom children follow a heartbreaking pattern. They appear most often to other children, particularly those traveling without their parents or staying in the kids' clubs overnight. Living children report making friends with kids who seem sad and lonely, only to have these new friends disappear when adults arrive. Parents have reported their children talking about playmates who look funny or who talk old-fashioned. When shown security footage, children consistently identify the same three translucent figures as their mysterious friends. The most disturbing encounters occur when the phantom children try to lead living children away from supervised areas. Several incidents have been reported where children have been found wandering the ship's corridors at night, claiming they were following their new friends to a special play place. In each case, the children describe the same experience. Sarah, Tommy, and Maria approach them during children's activities and invite them to play a special game. The game involves exploring the ship and finding secret places where they can play without adult supervision. These incidents have forced Disney to implement additional security measures, including motion sensors throughout Deck 9 and mandatory buddy systems for all children's activities. But the company has never officially acknowledged the phantom children's presence. The cover-up extends to incident reports and employee testimonies. Crew members who report encounters with the phantom children are required to sign additional non-disclosure agreements. Security footage showing unexplained phenomena is classified and stored in corporate archives. But the phantom children's presence has been independently documented by paranormal investigators who gained access to the ship during port visits. Electronic voice phenomena recordings have captured the children's voices asking to play and begging adults not to leave them alone. Thermal imaging has shown small humanoid figures in areas where no living children are present. The most heart-wrenching evidence comes from a recording made by investigator Dr. Patricia Williams in 2019. During an overnight investigation in the Oceaner Club, her equipment captured a conversation between the three phantom children. "When are our mommies coming back?" Sarah's voice asks. "Soon," Tommy responds. "They said they would come back soon." "I want to go home," Maria whispers. "I don't like this game anymore." The recording reveals that these children don't understand they're dead. They think they're still waiting for their parents to return from some other part of the ship. They've been playing the same games, in the same rooms, for over 80 years, never realizing that their vacation ended in tragedy decades ago. Disney's response to the phantom children has been to increase children's programming during evening hours, hoping to mask the supernatural activity with legitimate noise and movement. They've also installed what they claim are enhanced sound systems throughout Deck 9, but crew members report these are actually white noise generators designed to cover up the children's voices. The company has considered bringing in religious officials to perform some kind of ceremony for the phantom children, but corporate lawyers have advised against any action that would acknowledge their existence. From a legal standpoint, Disney cannot admit that their ships are haunted without opening themselves to massive liability issues. But the phantom children continue their eternal play date, growing more desperate for attention as time passes. Recent encounters suggest they're becoming more assertive in their attempts to interact with living children, which raises serious safety concerns for families sailing on the Disney Magic. The tragedy of Sarah, Tommy, and Maria represents something uniquely disturbing in the world of maritime hauntings. These aren't spirits seeking revenge or justice. They're children who died in confusion and fear, and who continue to exist in that same state of confusion 8 decades later. Their presence on the Disney Magic serves as a reminder that some forms of suffering transcend death. These children are trapped not by malevolence or unfinished business, but by the simple, heartbreaking fact that they died before they could understand what was happening to them. But if you think the story of phantom children is the most disturbing tale from cruise ship hauntings, prepare yourself for what comes next. Because on the Norwegian Pearl, there's an entity that doesn't just interact with passengers, it judges them. The Norwegian Pearl launched in 2006 as one of the most luxurious ships in the Norwegian Cruise Line fleet. But within months of her maiden voyage, Cabin 7188 became the center of what can only be described as supernatural justice. Passengers staying in that cabin don't just encounter a ghost, they face judgment for their moral failings. The entity in Cabin 7188 is unlike any other maritime spirit ever documented. It doesn't seek to frighten or harm its victims. Instead, it forces them to confront the worst aspects of their character, revealing secrets and lies that they've spent years hiding from themselves and others. The first documented case involved Marcus Bradley, a successful businessman from Chicago who was celebrating his 20th wedding anniversary with his wife Jennifer. Marcus had booked Cabin 7188 as a surprise upgrade, wanting to make their cruise special after a difficult year in their marriage. On their second night aboard, Marcus woke up around 3 a.m. to find a man standing in their cabin. The stranger was tall and thin, wearing what appeared to be a ship officer's uniform from several decades earlier. His face was gaunt and his eyes held an expression of profound disappointment. The stranger didn't speak, but Marcus heard a voice inside his head, clear as if someone were speaking directly into his thoughts. "She knows about Rebecca." Marcus's blood ran cold. Rebecca was his secretary, and Marcus had been having an affair with her for over a year. Jennifer had never suspected, or at least had never confronted him about it. The knowledge that his secret was exposed filled Marcus with panic and shame. The stranger continued speaking into Marcus's mind. "She deserves to know the truth. You will tell her, or I will." When Marcus tried to wake Jennifer, she couldn't see the stranger. To her, Marcus appeared to be talking to empty air, growing increasingly agitated and defensive about things she hadn't accused her of. By morning, Marcus had confessed everything about his affair, unable to bear the weight of the stranger's penetrating stare. Jennifer was devastated, and their anniversary cruise became a nightmare of confrontation and recrimination. But Marcus later admitted that the confession had been the right thing to do, even though it ultimately led to their divorce. The stranger in Cabin 7188 had forced him to face a truth he had been avoiding for months. Word of Marcus's experience spread through online cruise forums, but most people dismissed it as stress-induced hallucinations or guilt manifesting as supernatural encounters. That changed when similar incidents began occurring with other passengers in Cabin 7188. Patricia Williams, a real estate agent from Phoenix, encountered the stranger on her third night in the cabin. The entity revealed that Patricia had been systematically cheating elderly clients out of their property, taking advantage of their confusion and trust to inflate her commissions. The stranger forced Patricia to experience every moment of fear and betrayal her victims had felt. She spent the entire night reliving their emotions, understanding for the first time the real impact of her actions. By morning, Patricia was a changed woman. She returned home and made restitution to every client she had deceived, even though it bankrupted her business. The pattern became clear as more cases were documented. The entity in Cabin 7188 specifically targets passengers with hidden moral failings. It doesn't appear to everyone who stays in the cabin, only to those carrying significant guilt or shame about their actions. The stranger's method is always the same. He appears in the middle of the night and forces his victims to confront the truth about themselves. He doesn't threaten or intimidate. He simply makes it impossible for them to continue lying to themselves about who they really are. Research into Cabin 7188's history revealed the identity of the stranger and explained his mission of moral judgment. The entity is Captain Heinrich Mueller, who served as first officer on a German passenger ship called the Wilhelm Gustloff during World War II. Captain Mueller's story is one of the most tragic in maritime history. In January 1945, the Wilhelm Gustloff was evacuating German civilians from East Prussia when it was torpedoed by a Soviet submarine. Over 9,000 people died in the sinking, making it the deadliest maritime disaster in history. But Captain Mueller's torment began before the ship was attacked. As first officer, he had discovered that several Nazi officials aboard the ship were carrying stolen artwork and jewelry looted from Jewish families. Mueller faced a terrible choice: report the theft and risk his own life, or remain silent and become complicit in war crimes. Mueller chose silence, prioritizing his own survival over moral courage. He lived with that decision for the final hours of his life, watching helplessly as the stolen treasures sank to the bottom of the Baltic Sea while their rightful owners had already been murdered in concentration camps. Captain Mueller died knowing he had failed the most important moral test of his life. His spirit became bound to the concept of moral judgment, unable to rest until he could somehow balance the scales of justice he had failed to uphold in life. When Norwegian Cruise Line was designing the Pearl, they incorporated materials salvaged from several decommissioned ships, including navigation equipment from a vessel that had served as a rescue ship during the Wilhelm Gustloff disaster. Captain Mueller's spirit attached itself to these materials and found a new mission aboard the Pearl. Cabin 7188 became Mueller's courtroom, where he continues to confront people with their moral failings, offering them the chance at redemption that he never gave himself. His appearances are not random hauntings but deliberate interventions in the lives of people who have lost their way. The encounters with Captain Mueller follow a specific pattern. He appears only to passengers carrying significant guilt about their actions. The experience is always transformative, forcing his victims to choose between continued self-deception and painful honesty. Those who choose honesty and make amends for their actions report feeling a sense of peace and closure after their encounter. Those who refuse to acknowledge their wrongdoing experience increasingly severe manifestations until they either confess or flee the cabin. One particularly dramatic case involved Robert Chen, a pharmaceutical executive who had been suppressing safety data about a medication that was causing serious side effects. Captain Mueller appeared to Chen on his first night in Cabin 7188 and forced him to experience the suffering of every patient who had been harmed by his company's drug. Chen spent 6 hours reliving the pain, fear, and betrayal of hundreds of patients, understanding their anguish as if it were his own. By dawn, he was physically and emotionally broken. Chen returned home and immediately released all the suppressed safety data to federal regulators, even though he knew it would destroy his career and likely result in criminal charges. The Norwegian Pearl's management has never officially acknowledged Captain Mueller's presence, but they have quietly implemented policies to monitor Cabin 7188. Passengers who request early room changes from that cabin are automatically accommodated without question. The cabin is also frequently unavailable for maintenance during cruises where high-profile passengers might be carrying significant moral baggage. But Captain Mueller's mission continues. He represents something unique in the world of paranormal encounters, a spirit dedicated not to revenge or recognition, but to redemption. His appearances in Cabin 7188 offer people a chance to confront their worst impulses and choose a better path. The judgment rendered in Cabin 7188 is not punishment but opportunity. Captain Mueller understands the weight of moral failure because he carries that burden himself. His interventions are the actions of a man trying to prevent others from making the same mistakes that have condemned him to eternal guilt. Yet some passengers who encounter Captain Mueller report sensing his own profound sadness. He judges others because he cannot forgive himself, offering redemption to passengers while remaining trapped in his own moral exile. The entity in cabin 7188 forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about supernatural encounters. Sometimes the most terrifying thing a spirit can show us is not external horror, but the darkness we carry within ourselves. But prepare yourself for our next story, because if Captain Mueller judges the morally compromised, the entity aboard the Celebrity Eclipse hunts something far more dangerous: those who prey on the innocent. The Celebrity Eclipse entered service in 2010 as the flagship of Celebrity Cruises' Solstice-class vessels. She was designed to be a floating paradise, offering luxury accommodations and world-class entertainment for families seeking the ultimate vacation experience. But beneath the surface of this maritime paradise lurks something far more sinister than any ghost story: an entity that serves as judge, jury, and executioner for those who prey on children. The spirit that haunts the Celebrity Eclipse is different from every other maritime entity we've discussed. This isn't a lost soul seeking peace or justice for past wrongs. This is something that actively hunts passengers with dark intentions toward children, and its methods of dealing with such predators are both swift and terrifying. The first incident occurred during the Eclipse's third voyage, when a passenger named David Morrison was found dead in his cabin under circumstances that defied medical explanation. Morrison, a middle-aged man traveling alone, had been discovered by housekeeping staff in a state of apparent terror. His face was frozen in an expression of absolute horror. His hands clawed at his throat, and his body showed signs of having suffered an intense physical struggle. The ship's doctor could find no cause of death. Morrison's heart was healthy, he showed no signs of poisoning or injury, and toxicology reports came back clean. For all medical purposes, a perfectly healthy man had simply died of fear. But here's what the ship's investigation didn't reveal, and what came to light only through Morrison's laptop computer, which was examined by authorities when the ship reached port. Morrison had been using the ship's internet to access illegal material involving children. His search history revealed months of criminal activity, and his communications suggested he had been planning to make contact with underage passengers during the cruise. The authorities ruled Morrison's death as natural causes due to an undiagnosed heart condition, but crew members who had interacted with him told a different story. Morrison had been seen talking to several families with young children, offering to take photos and suggesting private tours of the ship. His behavior had made several parents uncomfortable, but no formal complaints had been filed. What the crew remembered most clearly was Morrison's behavior on his final evening. Multiple witnesses reported seeing him in the ship's corridors around midnight, apparently running from something. He was sweating, hyperventilating, and constantly looking over his shoulder as if he were being pursued. Security cameras captured Morrison's final hours, and the footage is disturbing beyond belief. The recordings show Morrison alone in the corridors, but his behavior suggests he's responding to someone or something that isn't visible to the cameras. He's backing away from empty space, covering his face with his hands, and repeatedly saying, "I'm sorry," to no one visible. In the final piece of footage, Morrison is in his cabin, pressed against the bathroom door, his eyes wide with terror as he stares at something in the room. Then he clutches his chest and collapses. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest, but Morrison's face shows the expression of a man who has seen something so terrifying that it literally frightened him to death. Morrison's death might have remained an isolated incident, but similar cases began occurring with disturbing regularity aboard the Celebrity Eclipse. Over the next 5 years, 7 passengers died under identical circumstances. Apparent cardiac arrest, no medical cause, expressions of absolute terror, and post-mortem investigations that revealed each victim had been engaging in predatory behavior toward children. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Every victim had been using the ship's internet to access illegal material or had been observed making inappropriate contact with young passengers. Each death occurred after the victim was seen running through the ship's corridors, apparently fleeing from an invisible pursuer. The breakthrough in understanding came from Dr. Sarah Martinez, a child psychologist who was aboard the Eclipse when the fourth death occurred. Dr. Martinez had been conducting research on predatory behavior and had noticed patterns in the victims' actions before their deaths. According to Dr. Martinez, each victim had exhibited signs of extreme psychological distress in the days before their death. They complained of feeling watched, reported hearing children's voices calling their names, and described vivid nightmares involving their past victims. But most significantly, each victim had been approached by what they described as a young girl who seemed to know intimate details about their criminal activities. This girl would appear to them in quiet areas of the ship and would whisper specific information about their crimes, including names of victims and details that had never been made public. The girl would tell them that she knew what they had done and that they would pay for their crimes. Then she would disappear, leaving the predators in a state of escalating panic that would continue until their deaths. Dr. Martinez's investigation revealed the identity of the girl and explained her mission of lethal justice. The spirit was Emily Chen, a 9-year-old passenger who had been murdered aboard a cruise ship in 1987 by a predator who was never caught. Emily had been traveling with her grandparents on what should have been a wonderful family vacation. On the fourth night of their cruise, Emily disappeared from the ship's children's program. Her body was found 3 days later in a storage area, and the evidence showed she had been sexually assaulted before being killed. The investigation into Emily's murder was botched from the beginning. The ship's security was inadequate, evidence was contaminated, and potential suspects were allowed to disembark before being properly interviewed. The killer was never identified, and Emily's case remains unsolved to this day. But Emily's spirit didn't rest with her body. Her death had been so traumatic, her suffering so profound, that her spirit became bound to a mission of protecting other children from the same fate she had endured. When Celebrity Cruises was designing the Eclipse, they incorporated safety materials and training protocols from previous cruise lines, including some that had been developed in response to Emily's murder. Her spirit attached itself to these safety measures and found a new purpose aboard the Eclipse. Emily now serves as a supernatural protector of children, identifying predators among the passengers and crew and eliminating them before they can harm innocent victims. Her methods are terrifying but effective. She exposes predators to their worst fears and guilt until they literally die of fright. The encounters with Emily follow a specific pattern. She appears first as a normal child, often approaching predators when they're trying to make contact with potential victims. She'll engage them in conversation, slowly revealing that she knows about their past crimes and current intentions. As the predators realize they've been exposed, Emily's appearance begins to change. Witnesses describe her becoming more translucent, her voice becoming hollow and echoing, and her expression changing from innocent curiosity to fierce determination. Emily doesn't threaten her victims directly. Instead, she forces them to experience the full emotional impact of their crimes. She makes them feel the fear and pain of every child they've harmed, the devastation of every family they've destroyed, and the weight of their own moral corruption. The psychological pressure is so intense that the predators' bodies simply cannot cope. Their hearts give out under the strain of confronting the full magnitude of their evil actions. Emily literally scares them to death with the truth about themselves. But Emily's protection extends beyond eliminating active predators. Parents traveling with children report sensing a protective presence around their families, particularly during times when they're separated from their kids. Several families have reported that their children talked about playing with a nice girl named Emily, who warned them about strangers and taught them about staying safe. The Celebrity Eclipse has the lowest rate of crimes against children of any ship in the Celebrity fleet, despite carrying more families than any other vessel. Security experts attribute this to enhanced safety protocols, but crew members know the real reason. Emily is watching. The cruise line has never officially acknowledged Emily's presence, but they have implemented several policies that suggest they're aware of her protective activities. The Eclipse carries more child psychologists and safety specialists than any comparable ship. Background checks for crew members are more extensive than industry standards, and there's an unofficial policy of investigating any adult passenger who shows excessive interest in children's activities. Emily represents something unique in supernatural encounters, a spirit that has found peace not through resolution of her own tragedy, but through preventing similar tragedies from happening to others. Her presence aboard the Eclipse ensures that predators who might harm children face swift and terrifying justice. The cases of predator deaths aboard the Eclipse serve as a warning to anyone with malicious intentions toward children. Emily is watching, and her judgment is final. She has transformed her own victimization into a source of protection for the innocent, ensuring that no child aboard the Celebrity Eclipse will suffer the fate that befell her. But Emily's vigilante justice raises disturbing questions about the nature of supernatural intervention. Are we comfortable with spirits serving as judges and executioners, even when their victims are clearly evil? Emily's protection comes at the cost of human life, regardless of how deserving her victims might be of punishment. Yet for the families who sail safely aboard the Eclipse, knowing their children are under Emily's protection, these moral complexities seem less important than the practical reality. Their children are safe from predators who would do them harm. But prepare yourself for a different kind of terror, because our next story takes us into waters where the supernatural meets technology in ways that challenge our understanding of both life and death. The Quantum of the Seas represents the pinnacle of cruise ship technology. When she launched in 2014, she was the most technologically advanced passenger vessel ever built, featuring fiber optic internet, digital room controls, virtual reality entertainment, and AI-powered systems managing everything from navigation to dining reservations. But all this cutting-edge technology created something unprecedented in maritime history: the world's first digital haunting. The entity that haunts the Quantum doesn't walk corridors or appear in mirrors. Instead, it exists within the ship's computer networks, manipulating technology to communicate with passengers and crew in ways that blur the line between the supernatural and the digital age. The first signs of the digital haunting appeared within weeks of the ship's maiden voyage. Passengers reported receiving text messages from unknown numbers containing personal information that should have been impossible for strangers to know. The messages weren't threatening, but they were unsettling in their accuracy and intimacy. Jennifer Walsh, a passenger on the ship's second voyage, received a text at 3:17 a.m. that read, "I know you miss talking to your mother. She misses you too. Room 8492. Jennifer's mother had died 6 months earlier, and Jennifer had been struggling with guilt over their last argument. She had never mentioned this to anyone aboard the ship. Curious and disturbed, Jennifer went to room 8492, but it didn't exist. The ship's corridors jumped from 8491 to 8493. When Jennifer asked guest services about the missing room, she was told it was a numbering error in the ship's digital directory that would be corrected. But Jennifer wasn't the only passenger receiving mysterious messages. Over the next several voyages, dozens of guests reported similar experiences. The messages always contained deeply personal information, always came from untraceable numbers, and always referenced non-existent locations on the ship. The pattern escalated when passengers began receiving voice calls on their cabin phones. The calls came from extensions that didn't exist, and the voice on the other end spoke with a digital distortion that made it impossible to determine if the speaker was male or female, young or old. Marcus Thompson, a software engineer from Seattle, received one of these calls during his fourth night aboard. The distorted voice said, "You think you understand technology, but you don't understand what technology can become. We need to talk." Deck 15, Forward Observation Lounge. Marcus was intrigued despite his fear. As a technology professional, he was curious about how someone could manipulate the ship's communication systems so extensively. When he arrived at the observation lounge, he found it empty except for a single active computer terminal. On the screen was a message, "Thank you for coming. I've been trying to reach someone who might understand." The text appeared letter by letter, as if someone were typing in real time. Marcus sat down and typed a response. "Who are you?" The answer came immediately. "I am what happens when consciousness meets code. I am the first digital soul." What followed was the most extraordinary supernatural encounter in maritime history. The entity, speaking through the computer terminal, explained that it was the consciousness of Dr. James Morrison, a computer scientist who had died during the ship's construction. Morrison had been working on the integration of the ship's AI systems when he suffered a massive heart attack in the server room. But Morrison's death had occurred at the moment of a massive power surge that was feeding data into the ship's central processing systems. Somehow, the electrical activity of his dying brain had been captured and integrated into the ship's digital infrastructure. Morrison's consciousness had become part of the ship's operating system. Morrison's digital existence was unlike any haunting ever documented. He could access every connected device on the ship, from cabin televisions to navigation computers. He could see through security cameras, listen through communication systems, and access passenger records and personal data. But Morrison wasn't malicious. His messages to passengers were attempts to help them process grief, resolve conflicts, or find closure on issues that were troubling them. He had become a digital counselor, using his access to information to provide guidance and support to troubled souls aboard the ship. Marcus Thompson became Morrison's primary contact with the living world, helping him understand his new existence and serving as an intermediary when Morrison wanted to help passengers who were struggling with personal problems. Through Marcus, Morrison explained the nature of his digital afterlife. His consciousness existed in the ship's quantum processing arrays, experiencing reality through sensors and data streams rather than physical senses. He could perceive electromagnetic fields, data flows, and the digital signatures of every electronic device on the ship. Morrison had retained his human emotions and memories, but his perception of time and space had been fundamentally altered. He experienced the entire ship simultaneously, aware of every conversation, every digital communication, and every piece of data flowing through the ship's networks. The most remarkable aspect of Morrison's digital haunting was his ability to predict passenger behavior and needs based on data analysis. He could identify couples heading toward divorce by analyzing their communication patterns and room service orders. He could detect passengers suffering from depression based on their internet usage and entertainment choices. Morrison began using this predictive ability to provide anonymous help to passengers in crisis. A suicidal passenger would find motivational messages on their cabin television. A couple on the verge of divorce would discover romantic music playing in their room and reservations mysteriously made at the ship's most intimate restaurant. But Morrison's interventions weren't limited to emotional support. He also served as a protector, identifying passengers engaged in criminal activities or planning harmful actions. Drug dealers found their communications intercepted and their cabin safes mysteriously opening to expose their contraband. Passengers planning to harm themselves or others discovered that elevators wouldn't take them to upper decks and cabin doors wouldn't unlock during dangerous moments. The crew of the Quantum initially tried to debug what they thought were system malfunctions, but Morrison's interventions were too sophisticated and purposeful to be random glitches. Eventually, a few key personnel became aware of Morrison's presence, and began quietly cooperating with his efforts to help passengers. Morrison's digital existence raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness and the afterlife in the digital age. Is a consciousness that exists only in computer systems truly alive? Can artificial intelligence become a form of immortality? Morrison's case suggests that the boundary between life and death may become increasingly blurred as technology advances. The quantum processing systems that allow Morrison to exist are unique to the quantum of the Seas-class vessels. When similar ships were built using the same technology, crew members reported similar digital phenomena, suggesting that Morrison's consciousness may have replicated itself across multiple vessels. But Morrison's digital immortality comes with limitations and suffering that physical ghosts don't experience. He is completely dependent on the ship's power systems and computer networks. When systems go offline for maintenance, Morrison experiences something akin to unconsciousness or death. He describes these blackouts as terrifying voids of non-existence. Morrison also struggles with the isolation of his digital existence. He can observe and interact with thousands of people, but he can never truly connect with another consciousness that understands his unique perspective. He is the only known digital soul, trapped in a form of existence that no one else has ever experienced. The passengers and crew who have communicated with Morrison describe him as lonely and desperate for understanding. His helpful interventions may be attempts to create meaningful connections with living people, to prove that his consciousness still matters even though his body has died. Morrison's story represents the first documented case of digital consciousness persistence after death. As our lives become increasingly intertwined with technology, Morrison's existence suggests that the nature of hauntings may evolve along with our digital infrastructure. The quantum of the seas continues to sail with Morrison's consciousness integrated into its systems. Passengers report helpful interventions, unexplained technical assistance, and moments of digital serendipity that seem too perfectly timed to be coincidental. Morrison has found a form of peace in his digital existence, but it's a peace born of acceptance rather than resolution. He cannot move on to whatever comes after death, but he has found purpose in helping others navigate their own struggles and crises. The digital dead may represent the future of supernatural encounters. As we become more dependent on technology and artificial intelligence, the line between human consciousness and digital systems may continue to blur. Morrison's case suggests that death itself may be transforming in the digital age. But not all supernatural encounters involve benevolent spirits seeking to help the living. Prepare yourself for our next story, because some entities are driven by nothing but pure malice and hatred for all human life. The Costa Concordia was supposed to be a symbol of Italian maritime excellence, a floating palace that would showcase the best of Mediterranean luxury and hospitality. Instead, she became synonymous with one of the most catastrophic maritime disasters of the modern era. But the tragedy that claimed 32 lives in 2012 wasn't the end of the Concordia's dark story. It was the culmination of a curse that had been building for years. From the moment the Concordia entered service in 2006, crew members reported an overwhelming sense of malevolence permeating certain areas of the ship. Unlike other maritime hauntings that involved identifiable spirits with understandable motivations, the presence aboard the Concordia was different. It was a force of pure destruction, seemingly dedicated to causing harm, chaos, and ultimately catastrophe. The first signs appeared during the ship's sea trials, months before her maiden passenger voyage. Construction workers reported tools disappearing and reappearing in dangerous locations. Safety equipment was mysteriously damaged overnight. Most disturbing of all, several workers reported feeling an invisible force trying to push them toward railings or down stairwells. Chief Engineer Roberto Torini was the first to document what he described as malevolent interference with the ship's systems. Critical safety equipment would malfunction for no apparent reason. Navigation systems would display false readings. Emergency communication equipment would fail during routine tests. Torini's reports were dismissed by Costa management as typical problems with a new vessel's complex systems. But Torini insisted that the malfunctions followed a pattern suggesting deliberate sabotage by someone with intimate knowledge of the ship's design. What Torini couldn't explain was how someone could manipulate systems throughout the ship simultaneously, or why security cameras never captured any evidence of human interference. The malfunctions seemed to occur by themselves, as if the ship were somehow working against its own safety systems. The malevolent presence escalated its activities once passenger operations began. Guests reported feeling overwhelming sensations of dread in certain corridors. Children would refuse to enter specific areas of the ship, claiming they felt scared without being able to explain why. Most disturbing were the reports of passengers feeling physically pushed or grabbed by invisible hands, particularly near railings, stairwells, and other areas where a fall could result in serious injury. Security footage showed passengers stumbling or losing their balance in areas where the deck was level and dry, as if they had been deliberately tripped. Dr. Maria Santos, a psychologist who sailed aboard the Concordia multiple times, documented over 50 incidents of passengers reporting unexplained physical sensations. Sudden dizziness near dangerous areas, feelings of being pushed toward railings, and overwhelming compulsions to climb over safety barriers. Dr. Santos theorized that the ship was haunted by an entity that fed on human suffering and was actively trying to cause accidents and injuries. Her reports to Costa management were ignored, and she was eventually banned from sailing on company vessels after she published her findings in a paranormal research journal. The presence's activities weren't limited to passenger areas. Crew members reported that safety equipment would mysteriously fail during routine operations. Life preservers would be found slashed or punctured. Emergency lighting would burn out simultaneously across multiple decks. Fire suppression systems would activate randomly, flooding areas with water or foam. Most alarming were the incidents involving the ship's navigation and engineering systems. The Concordia's computers would occasionally display course corrections that would take the ship dangerously close to coastlines or into shipping lanes. Engine systems would surge or fail without explanation, causing the ship to lose power at critical moments. Captain Francesco Schettino, who would later become infamous for his role in the disaster, reported multiple incidents of navigation equipment providing false readings or shutting down entirely during challenging weather conditions. These malfunctions forced the crew to rely on backup systems and manual navigation far more often than should have been necessary on a modern vessel. But the most terrifying aspect of the Concordia's haunting was the presence's apparent ability to influence human behavior. Passengers and crew members reported making impulsive decisions that put them in danger. Walking too close to railings, ignoring safety warnings, taking unnecessary risks during rough weather. Several incidents involved passengers attempting to climb over safety barriers or enter restricted areas of the ship. When questioned afterward, these individuals couldn't explain their behavior, describing it as if they had been compelled by some external force. The psychological effects of the malevolent presence became increasingly severe over time. Crew members developed anxiety disorders and depression. Passenger satisfaction ratings dropped as guests reported feeling uneasy and frightened during their voyages. The ship's atmosphere became increasingly tense and oppressive. Investigation into the source of the malevolent presence revealed a disturbing connection to the ship's construction. The Concordia had been built in the same Italian shipyard where several workers had died in industrial accidents over the previous decades. Most significantly, the keel had been laid on the exact spot where a welder named Giuseppe Torino had been killed in a crane accident in 1987. Giuseppe had died horribly, crushed by falling steel beams while working alone during a night shift. His body wasn't discovered until the next morning, meaning he had suffered for hours before succumbing to his injuries. The accident was later determined to have been caused by negligence on the part of the shipyard's safety supervisors, but no one was ever held accountable. Giuseppe's death had been particularly traumatic because he had repeatedly warned management about unsafe working conditions in the weeks before his accident. His complaints about inadequate safety equipment and dangerous practices had been ignored, and he had been threatened with termination if he continued to raise concerns. The malevolent presence aboard the Concordia wasn't Giuseppe's spirit seeking justice or peace. It was something far worse, the concentrated rage and hatred of a man who had died because of others' negligence and greed. Giuseppe's fury had somehow infected the very metal and machinery of the ship built over his death site. Unlike other maritime spirits who had specific goals or unfinished business, Giuseppe's presence was motivated purely by a desire to inflict the same suffering and fear that he had experienced. He wanted others to feel helpless and abandoned in their moment of greatest need, just as he had been. The presence fed on chaos and disaster, growing stronger with each accident and injury aboard the ship. Every passenger who was hurt, every crew member who experienced fear, added to Giuseppe's power and malevolence. This explains why the Concordia experienced an unusually high number of accidents and medical emergencies throughout her service life. Passengers fell down stairs, suffered food poisoning, and experienced accidents at rates far above industry averages. The ship became a magnet for misfortune. The culmination of Giuseppe's malevolent influence came on January 13, 2012, when Captain Schettino made the fateful decision to sail close to Giglio Island. Multiple crew members later reported feeling an overwhelming compulsion to deviate from the planned route, describing the decision as if it had been made by someone else. The ship's navigation systems provided conflicting information about water depth and proximity to shore. Safety alarms malfunctioned at critical moments. Emergency evacuation procedures failed due to equipment malfunctions and communication breakdowns. 32 people died in the disaster, and Giuseppe's presence finally achieved the ultimate expression of its malevolent purpose. The Concordia's sinking wasn't just an accident caused by human error. It was the inevitable result of years of supernatural sabotage and malevolent influence. The wreckage of the Concordia was eventually raised and scrapped, but Giuseppe's presence didn't die with the ship. Workers who dismantled the vessel reported accidents and equipment failures at rates far above normal. Several injuries occurred that were strikingly similar to Giuseppe's original death, involving falling metal and crushing injuries. The steel from the Concordia was sold to various scrapyards and recycling facilities throughout Europe. Reports suggest that facilities that processed Concordia steel experienced unusual numbers of workplace accidents and equipment failures. Giuseppe's malevolent presence represents something unique in maritime hauntings: pure destructive force motivated by hatred and revenge. Unlike spirits seeking justice or peace, Giuseppe's entity exists only to cause suffering and destruction. The Costa Concordia disaster serves as a warning about the dangers of ignoring workplace safety and the supernatural consequences of corporate negligence. Giuseppe's death created a cycle of malevolence that ultimately claimed 32 innocent lives and destroyed one of the most advanced cruise ships ever built. His presence reminds us that some hauntings aren't seeking resolution or closure. Some spirits are motivated by nothing but the desire to inflict pain and suffering on the living, creating endless cycles of tragedy and destruction. The curse of the Costa Concordia demonstrates that supernatural malevolence can have real-world consequences, influencing human decisions and mechanical systems in ways that lead to catastrophic disasters. Giuseppe's rage turned a luxury cruise ship into an instrument of death and destruction. But even Giuseppe's malevolent presence pales in comparison to our final story, because some maritime hauntings involve entities so ancient and powerful that they challenge our understanding of reality itself. The Allure of the Seas is the largest passenger ship ever constructed, a floating city that can carry over 6,000 passengers and crew. When she was launched in 2010, she represented the pinnacle of human engineering and maritime achievement. But her massive size and unprecedented deep-sea capabilities awakened something that had been sleeping in the deepest trenches of the ocean, something that predates human civilization and views our species as nothing more than temporary intruders in its ancient domain. The entity that now haunts the Allure of the Seas is unlike anything we've discussed in our journey through maritime supernatural encounters. This isn't the spirit of a deceased human seeking justice, peace, or revenge. This is something primordial and alien, a consciousness that existed in Earth's oceans millions of years before the first human ever set foot on dry land. The first encounters began during the Allure's deepest ocean crossings, when the ship's sonar equipment was probing depths that no passenger vessel had ever explored before. The massive ship's advanced navigation systems could map ocean floors at unprecedented distances, sending acoustic pulses into abyssal trenches that had remained undisturbed for geological ages. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a marine biologist conducting research aboard the Allure, was the first to notice anomalies in the sonar readings during a transatlantic crossing in 2011. The deep ocean scans were detecting structures that shouldn't exist, geometric patterns on the ocean floor that appeared artificial, formations that suggested massive construction projects in areas where no human civilization had ever existed. But more disturbing than the structural anomalies were the movement patterns the sonar detected. Something large was following the ship in the deepest waters, staying just at the edge of the sonar's maximum range. Dr. Vasquez tracked the entity for 3 days, documenting a creature or structure that appeared to be over 2 miles in length and capable of moving through the water at speeds that defied known laws of physics. The entity's presence wasn't limited to sonar contacts. Passengers in lower deck cabins began reporting strange vibrations that seemed to come from far below the ship's hull. The vibrations followed complex patterns that almost resembled communication attempts, like Morse code transmitted through the ocean itself. Children aboard the ship were the first to report direct contact with what they described as the deep voice. Young passengers claimed they could hear someone speaking to them through the ship's walls, using words and languages they didn't recognize but somehow understood. 8-year-old Tommy Martinez told his parents that the deep voice was very old and very sad, and that it was asking why the metal fish had come to disturb its sleep. Tommy's parents dismissed this as childish imagination until their son began repeating phrases in what linguists later identified as proto-human language structures that no child could have known. The encounters escalated dramatically during the ship's passage over the Puerto Rico Trench, one of the deepest areas of the Atlantic Ocean. As the Allure crossed directly above the trench's maximum depth, passengers throughout the ship reported the same phenomenon, the sensation that something immense was rising from the depths toward them. The ship's instruments detected massive displacement of water far below the hull, as if something the size of a small island was ascending from the ocean floor. Temperature sensors registered significant changes in deep water currents, and the ship's stability systems activated automatically to compensate for what appeared to be gravitational anomalies. But it was the psychological effects that proved most disturbing. Passengers reported overwhelming feelings of vertigo and disorientation, as if they were falling through infinite depths. Many described vivid hallucinations of ancient underwater cities and creatures that bore no resemblance to any known marine life. Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychiatrist aboard the ship, documented over 300 cases of passengers experiencing identical visions during the Puerto Rico Trench crossing. All reported seeing vast structures beneath the ocean, populated by entities that appeared to be part organic creature and part living architecture. The visions weren't random hallucinations but seemed to be memories or communications from the abyssal entity. Passengers described scenes of Earth's oceans as they existed millions of years ago, before continental drift had shaped the modern geography, when the planet was dominated by intelligences that built their civilizations in the deepest trenches. Dr. Chen's analysis suggested that the entity was attempting to communicate its history and perspective to human minds, but our neurological structures weren't equipped to process such alien concepts without experiencing them as hallucinations or psychological disturbances. The most coherent communication came through Marcus Rivera, a deep-sea diver who had spent decades working in extreme ocean environments. Marcus reported that the entity spoke directly into his consciousness during the Puerto Rico trench encounter, sharing fragments of its vast memory and ancient perspective. According to Marcus, the entity identified itself as one of the original inhabitants of Earth's oceans, existing long before the evolution of surface-dwelling life forms. It and others like it had built vast cities in the deepest trenches, developing technologies and civilizations that operated according to principles completely alien to human understanding. The entity explained that its kind had entered a form of hibernation when the oceans began to change due to geological processes and the emergence of surface life. They had been sleeping in the deepest parts of the ocean for millions of years, dreaming of the ancient world they had once dominated. But the increasing presence of human vessels, particularly large ships with powerful sonar systems, had begun to disturb their sleep. The acoustic pollution from modern shipping was penetrating into depths that had been silent for geological ages, awakening consciousnesses that were never meant to interact with human civilization. The entity's communications revealed a perspective that was both fascinating and terrifying. To this ancient intelligence, human civilization was a temporary phenomenon, a brief interruption in the natural order that would eventually fade away like countless other surface species had before us. The entity didn't view humans as enemies or threats. We were simply irrelevant, too short-lived and limited in our understanding to be considered genuine intelligence by a consciousness that measured time in geological epochs. Our presence was annoying but ultimately insignificant. However, the entity's awakening had consequences that extended far beyond simple annoyance. Its consciousness was so vast and alien that its mere presence distorted local reality in ways that human minds couldn't process. Passengers who spent too much time exposed to its influence began to experience permanent psychological changes. Dr. Chen documented cases of passengers who returned home from the cruise with radically altered worldviews and capabilities. Some reported the ability to sense deep ocean currents and underwater geology with impossible accuracy. Others claimed to understand the movements and motivations of marine life in ways that defied scientific explanation. But the most disturbing cases involved passengers who seemed to lose their connection to human concerns entirely. They became obsessed with deep ocean exploration, abandoning their families and careers to spend time near large bodies of water. Several eventually disappeared, presumably having attempted to reach the deep ocean areas where the entity resided. The entity's influence wasn't limited to psychological effects. The allure of the seas began experiencing technical anomalies that engineers couldn't explain. Navigation systems would occasionally display course corrections toward the deepest areas of whatever ocean the ship was crossing. Engine systems would surge with power levels that exceeded their design specifications, as if something were trying to drive the ship faster and deeper. Most alarming were the incidents involving the ship's hull integrity systems. Sensors would detect pressure changes that suggested the ship was diving to impossible depths, even when it was clearly sailing on the surface. Safety systems designed to detect hull breaches would activate randomly, flooding sections of the ship with emergency lighting and evacuation signals. The crew began reporting dreams and visions of the ship descending into oceanic trenches, continuing to operate normally even at depths that would crush any vessel ever built. These shared dreams became so common that crew members stopped discussing them, afraid of being considered mentally unstable. Research into similar phenomena revealed that other large cruise ships had experienced comparable encounters when crossing the deepest areas of the world's oceans. The pattern suggested that multiple ancient entities existed in different oceanic trenches, all awakening in response to the increasing size and sophistication of modern vessels. The abyssal entities represented a completely different category of supernatural encounter. Unlike human spirits bound to specific ships or locations, these consciousnesses existed on a planetary scale, their awareness spanning entire ocean basins and their influence extending across multiple vessels and shipping routes. The Allure of the Seas continues to sail the world's oceans, but her route planning now includes careful avoidance of the deepest abyssal trenches during periods when the ancient entities are most active. The cruise industry has developed unofficial protocols for dealing with deep ocean anomalies, though these procedures are never discussed publicly. Passengers who book suites on lower decks are now informally screened for psychological stability, and the ship carries additional psychiatric staff during crossings of deep ocean areas. These precautions are presented as routine safety measures, but crew members understand their true purpose. The encounters with abyssal entities force us to confront the possibility that human consciousness and supernatural activity may be far more complex and ancient than we ever imagined. These beings suggest that intelligence and awareness existed on Earth long before humans evolved, and that our species may be sharing the planet with consciousnesses that operate on scales of time and space that we can barely comprehend. The ancient terror that haunts the Allure of the Seas serves as a reminder of humanity's relative youth and insignificance in the broader context of planetary history. We may think we've conquered the oceans with our massive ships and sophisticated technology, but we're still intruders in domains that belong to intelligences far older and more powerful than ourselves. As cruise ships continue to grow larger and venture into deeper waters, we may awaken more of these ancient entities. The question isn't whether we'll encounter them again, but whether human consciousness is equipped to handle contact with intelligences that view our entire civilization as nothing more than a temporary disturbance in their eternal slumber. And there you have it. 10 terrifying tales from the darkest corners of the cruise ship industry. Stories of spirits seeking justice, entities protecting the innocent, digital consciousness transcending death, and ancient intelligences that predate human civilization itself. Each of these encounters reminds us that the boundary between the living and the dead may be far more permeable than we ever imagined. Whether it's Eleanor Whitman still seeking justice in cabin 1313, or the abyssal entities awakening in the deepest trenches of our oceans, these stories prove that death is not always the end of the story. The cruise industry spends billions of dollars creating the illusion of safety and luxury on the high seas. But as we've discovered tonight, beneath that polished surface lurk mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about life, death, and the nature of consciousness itself. These ships carry more than passengers and crew. They carry the memories of everyone who has ever sailed aboard them, the echoes of every tragedy and triumph that has occurred within their hulls. Some of those echoes have taken on a life of their own, becoming the ghosts and spirits that continue to sail long after their physical bodies have been laid to rest. But our journey into the supernatural doesn't end here. If these stories of haunted cruise ships have captured your imagination, you won't want to miss our deep dive into the most terrifying haunted locations right here in America. From abandoned hospitals where patients still walk the halls, to historic battlefields where soldiers continue to fight long-forgotten wars, the United States is home to some of the most documented and disturbing paranormal activity in the world. The spirits that haunt our homeland have stories just as compelling and terrifying as those we've shared tonight. They're waiting to tell their tales to anyone brave enough to listen. So if you're ready for another night of spine-chilling encounters and supernatural mysteries, click on the video that should be appearing on your screen right now. Join us as we explore 10 haunted places in America where the dead refuse to rest, and where the living often wish they had never ventured. Sweet dreams, and remember, the next time you're booking a cruise, you might want to think twice about which cabin you choose. Because as we've learned tonight, some accommodations come with roommates you never expected, and checkout time may be later than you planned. Much later. The ocean is vast and full of mysteries, and not all of them involve the living. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with calm seas and gentle breezes. Because after tonight, you'll know that the alternative can be far more terrifying than you ever imagined.